The European Union is turning into NATO's financial war machine. Two key positions in foreign and defense policy reveal the militaristic and Russophobic orientation of the European Union. Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, who acts as the executive of the European Union, announced her new team of commissioners for the next 5 years. Kaja Kallas, the new foreign minister of the 27-nation bloc, is a staunch Russophobe and energetic supporter of Ukraine. Kallas has called for more EU and NATO military funding for Ukraine to defeat Russia and dissolve the Russian Federation. The former Estonian Prime Minister has led the movement to destroy Red Army monuments in the Baltic states, and this while her husband, who is active as an investor, continues to profit from business with Russia. At Kallas's side, another fanatical Russophobe, former Lithuanian Prime Minister Andrius Kubilius, will occupy a newly created post as EU Defense Commissioner. The creation of this post is an alarming sign of how the EU bloc has transformed from a trade and political union to a military organization. But even more disturbing is the fact that an anti-Russia hawk like Kubilius has been entrusted with the direction of military policy. At a time when relations between the EU and Russia are so tense, the European bloc is giving politicians from hostile Baltic states the opportunity to push relations even further towards conflict. The first announcement Kubilius made as the future new defense commissioner was that the European Union would likely be at war with Russia for the next 6 to 8 years. This assessment is shared by Kaja Kallas. Kubilius said the only focus of his term in office was to increase military spending by EU states to strengthen NATO and support Ukraine. He said he would work closely with the head of foreign policy Kallas to unlock the funds. This means that the European Union is working towards obliging national budgets to allocate more funds to military procurement. This is a breakthrough for the worst possible reasons. According to reports, Kubilius is aiming for a budget of 500 billion euros, which the EU should spend on the military over the next 5 years. This increase would account for about half of the expected total EU budget. His remarks point to the purpose of the massive reallocation of funds to strengthen NATO. Kubilius noted that the European Union has tools to obtain greater funding that NATO does not have. This means that according to its wording and the mandatory directives from Brussels, the EU will oblige member states to spend more on the military. Membership in NATO and the EU overlaps. 23 of the 27 EU members also belong to the military alliance led by the USA. NATO countries are expected to spend at least 2% of their GDP on the military. That is around $380 billion for European NATO members in 2024. This is an enormous increase compared to the expenditure that these members made just a few years ago. But NATO planners always want more and more. The problem is to lock in these expenses. The problem for NATO planners is that the 2% is not binding. It depends on national politics. Even though most NATO members are currently achieving this goal, there is no guarantee that this will continue to be the case in the future. Changes in national governments could lead to spending falling back to the previous levels of 1 to 1.5% of GDP, as was the case before the outbreak of the proxy war in Ukraine in 2022. The greatest desire of the NATO hawks in the EU is to lock in military spending year after year. NATO does not have the legal means to enforce such a commitment in a binding manner for its members, but the EU can do this through its supranational powers, which are served by centralized directives from Brussels. The Baltic states of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia have increased their military spending to almost 3% of GDP during Kallas and Kubilius's tenures. Further, Kubilius has previously proposed that all EU members spend an extraordinary additional amount of 0.25% of their GDP on mandatory military donations to Ukraine to ensure victory over Russia, which would amount to 100 billion euros per year. This is an amazing transformation of the European Union. The organization has its roots in the 1950s as a loose trade association of Western European nations, predominantly France and the Federal Republic of Germany, who proclaimed that the lessons of World War II had been learned and would never be repeated, due to the commitment to good neighborliness and trade partnership. In its earlier manifestations, the European bloc sought friendly relations with the Soviet Union, with energy trade being a cornerstone of cooperation. Since the supposed end of the Cold War in 1991, the EU has expanded in line with NATO's expansion. Their powers have become more and more centralized, usurping national politics. A striking feature of both NATO and the EU is the intensification of Russophobic policies which go hand in hand with the involvement of the Russophobic Baltic states. Historically, these states were zealous collaborators of Nazi Germany in its genocidal war against the Soviet Union. The Baltic states are still home to fascists who worship the Third Reich. Hence, the destruction of Soviet-era war memorials and the restoration of public display boards in memory of the Nazi collaborators. NATO's proxy war in Ukraine against Russia is the continuation of Western imperialist plans to subjugate Russian territory previously pursued by Nazi Germany. The European Union has abandoned its former ideals of pacifism and cooperation and has become part of NATO's war machine. What the EU brings into the war machine is primarily legalized compulsory financing, even for states that do not belong to NATO. In addition, the EU is run by people who dream of a war with Russia. Von der Leyen, the former German defense minister and descendant of Nazi ideologues, is supported by Kaja Kallas and Andreas Kubilius, who cannot think of Russia without fantasizing about its defeat. The Nazi specter has resurrected in NATO and its EU financial wing.